Welcome, folks. See a few people on the call. We're going to get started. My name is Tyler Colburn. I am the professional development consultant here at the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. It is Monday morning, April 13th. Every single time I do one of these webinars right now, I keep going. I can't believe we're this far along in the year already. It feels like Christmas and the holidays was just the other day, but time's flying. You're here today with myself and our council president and social worker and community leader, amongst many other things, Robert Wright, for parenting and decision-making assessments part 3 of 4. We've offered 2 other sessions in this series already. They are recorded. I'll share the links to that and the links to this presentation. But yeah, this is the 3rd one, going a little bit deeper into the decision-making assessment guidelines. Before we get started, bear with me here. I do want to begin with a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Punamukutijik, which is at the Tom Cod Place in Mi'kmaq, colonially known as Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. I believe Robert is over at Chibuktuk, and we're located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. The inherent rights of the Mi'kmaq were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. Canada later reaffirmed the treaties in Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, and they remain active to this day. I invite folks to join us in the chat and name the land that you're on. How are you arriving? Anything else you want to share as we get started with our time together today? You have access to the chat and you have access to the Q&A, but where this is a webinar, you won't have access to your camera or your microphone. But we'd love to see some contributions in the chat and just give us a sense of how are you arriving? There's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot going on in society. There's a lot going on here locally. So however you're showing up is okay, but recognizing that many of us are probably carrying lots of different feelings and experiences at this current time. And as we acknowledge the land, it's important to recognize that the land doesn't need acknowledgement. What we're trying to do is to make visible and demonstrate our accountabilities to the people of this land and to the land. So myself, I'm a settler Canadian. Ancestry is predominantly Irish and British. I think a lot about my accountabilities to Mi'kmaq folks and other Indigenous people across Turtle Island and around the world who are engaged in resistance and resurgence and efforts towards liberation. So as we go through the content today around parenting and decision-making assessment guidelines and thinking critically about the factors around decision-making and also care and wellness for families and children, it's helpful potentially to also take a critical lens to the way settler colonialism and white supremacy are threaded through our systems and ways of operating, and hold that as we also acknowledge the land. And this is from Lauren Jerk, and these are some questions that are related to land acknowledgements and moving from acknowledgement to action. And she asks, how do you show gratitude for the land? What does it mean to practice reciprocity? What is the history of how you came to be on this land, and how has colonialism supported your arrival? And this is not equally true for everyone, but for most folks, we can take a critical lens and think about the ways that we arrived to this land. And so I invite you to consider this as we think about parenting and decision-making guidelines. Separate and distinct is also our commitment to people, or reparations for people of African descent. And when I say that, I'm thinking, very specifically about the, historical African Nova Scotians across 52 communities in this province, of roughly 20,000 people in this province who identify as African Nova Scotian, and people who have ancestry and connections and legacies with Black loyalists, the Maroons, and the Southern American Black refugees. And when we think about reparations and our commitment to solidarity and allyship, people of African descent, thinking about the contributions that people of African descent have made to the economy, the political landscape, the cultural landscape of this province, and how we can work in solidarity towards liberation. It is April. It's no longer African Heritage Month, but I do want to share the theme because I think it's on us, especially white folks like myself, to carry forward this theme in solidarity every day of the year. And the theme for this year was strength and unity, moving forward with a purpose, prosperity, power, and progress. And for us at the college, when we think about reparations, really it's about 5 different things. It's about restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and then finally, guarantees of non-repetition. And I want to highlight this one today because many times in social work practice or webinars or in educational content, we can use words, but we really need to align them with action, and we need to shift material resources and systems to be in solidarity and allyship. And so for us, reparations, when we think of guarantees of non-repetition, it's specifically about working towards preventing future human rights violations through awareness and education. And as we think about reparations, we think about land acknowledgement, we think about the content today, especially from a critical lens, I wanted to highlight this post from Ubuntu-centered practice. And she writes, because we deserve a society built for us all, without othering, minoritizing, or pushing anyone to the margins of oppression, I stand for anti-oppressive practice, intersectionality, equity, and every path that fosters collective liberation and communal wellness. Anti-oppressive practice is inherently intersectional, resisting all isms, inequities at the micro, meso, and macro levels. We get free together, united as one family. Let's resist and rebel against divide and conquer tactics. Want to let you know that you do have access to Robert's presentation. I'll put this in the chat as well. I'll put the link to this presentation in there. So feel free to access this content on your own time or follow along on your own. We also have our two previous recordings. We have the one in February, so session 1. We also have session 2, which was held last month in March, and this is session 3 today. For social workers, you should all be social workers in this call, I believe. You want to track this under formal professional development. So as you're doing your annual submission of tracking and recording PD, track this under formal professional development. So of course, as a learning activity, we're really hoping that you develop or shift some competency, and this specifically is around knowledge, skills, or values. So understanding root theory and concepts, and then being able to apply critical, ethical, and socially just approaches, and then examine and shift your beliefs and worldviews. Bear with me here. Don, I'm just going to lower your hand. I saw your hand was up. I'm not sure if there was something you need. You can send me a direct message in the chat, but we're not letting folks use their microphone today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll post some links in the chat. Again, you're encouraged to follow along with Robert's share screen, or you can follow on your own with the links I'm going to put in here. I'm also going to put in the links to the guidelines for parenting and decision-making assessments, so you can have those directly. There's a PDF and also a web page. And then finally, Robert wanted us to share some resources from the Toronto parenting assessments. So if you click on the link, the third one there, there's access to a manual, guidelines, and case examples from Toronto that might be useful in your practice. I think I'm ready to go. Robert, do you need anything else from me?
No, I think just your comforting presence in the background, I think, is all I need.
Okay. All right. I'll just randomly pop on the microphone and just say soothing things.
That's
Uh,
perfect.
Boy, we'll pass it over to you. And reminder, folks, please access the chat. Please access the Q&A. We can't guarantee we'll answer all the questions, depending on time and our own knowledge and Robert's own experience and expertise, but we're going to do our best. With that, I will go off audio and video and let you share your screen, Robert.
Thanks so much, Tyler. I can't say how much I appreciate how you frame things up for us. Welcome, everyone. Just want to welcome you to the third workshop in this series, which will be focusing on values and the formulation, values, ethics, and formulation. And I think that this will be a little more. We're starting after the values and ethics piece. We're going to start to put the wheels on this bus, if you will, in terms of how you actually then build an assessment. And I've been cutting and pasting, cobbling together a Frankenstein assessment, just we will get to look at it a little bit today. I will have something for you more substantially in the final part of this, where the final workshop on the fourth one is really highly interactive, and we'll be able to ask and answer a bunch of questions. And I hope in time for the fourth session to have, like I said, a better cobbled together assessment outline for you. This workshop really it wasn't designed to give you a concrete how-to step-by-step process in writing an assessment, but rather to familiarize yourself with the guidelines that govern social work assessment in parenting and decision-making matters. So Having said that, I think that a lot of people will find it useful to have somewhat of a guideline or an outline for that. So I'm just trying to set up my screen here so that I can okay, there we go. So, uh, oh, right church, wrong pew. Let me just stop that share for a second. Um, Sharing is one thing. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. I just started us in the wrong location on that slideshow. Okay, there we go. So, as I said, this is part three. And I'll just leaf through some of these slides. Tyler has already done a well-oriented us to the land acknowledgement. I always like to say that we need to remember that as social workers, we are in the problem-solving business, and many of the problems that we are unpacking are a result of the history of colonialism, and that's something I always like to remind myself in the work that I do. Right? And so I believe that acts of reconciliation, reparation, and considerations of these things are essential if we're going to live peaceably on the land. And that's just again that fetching picture of myself. That it's just a little bit about my background, and I think by now every social worker in the province is well aware of who I am and perhaps a little done with me. But there we have it. So here we are. We've worked already through part one, two, three, four, and five of the guidelines, considering the best interest of the child, knowledge set, clinical skills. And now we're going to step into values, implementation, and ethical considerations. I've kind of considered values and ethics together, and then we'll talk a little bit about implementation, or as we sometimes call it, formulation. This is the QR code for these slides. If you are following along, you'll have all of the slides, and then after the final slide in this series, I have kept several slides that are from earlier presentations, just because if there are some questions today, I may refer to them, those slides, in answering those questions. And let's just a bit of a review. Let's remember that the reason we've done this, these guidelines, is that the nature of assessments in this arena has changed since the federal regulations or the laws related to separation and divorce have changed. And now, instead of using custody access, we talk about decision making and parenting. And we have really three purposes with these guidelines: to improve social work practice in the area of assessing parenting and decision making, to improve the outcomes for children and their families, and to undo and right the harms that our practice in this area has caused in the past. I would say that it's fair to say that as professionals and the courts have organized or have to intervene in the lives of families, particularly during separation and divorce, but also, of course, in the field of child welfare, we have perhaps perpetrated as much harm as we have helped. And so, this, as we think about this practice now, we need to really be thinking about how do we undo and right those harms. Of course, we reflected in the first workshop on the concept of the best interest of the child, and we looked at how that developed over time. And we talked a little bit about the models of assessment: unstructured clinical judgment assessments that have no structure whatsoever to them, structured clinical judgment, which is an assessment model that still focuses mainly on clinical judgment, but gives a practitioner a structured set of considerations that they should work through in applying their clinical judgment. Actuarial assessments, which are some of those psychometrics and other kinds of standardized tools largely developed in the field of psychology, but not just in psychology. Certainly in forensic mental health, we use them a lot. And those are the tests. People fill out check sheets. You might fill out a check sheet yourself, and they actually produce numbers and statistics, and they're and they provide numbers for things that I find less helpful, and I'll explain that a little bit more. We then talked a little bit about the clinical and the nature of clinical social work and how that clinical social work is a broad continuum of social work practice, but that we need to apply when we come into this field of assessing parenting and decision making. And so that's just a quote from the Association of American Board of Clinical Social Work around this whole issue of bringing theories into this practice. So when we start to talk about values and ethics, it sometimes is helpful to differentiate the two. And for the purposes of this workshop, I've kind of cobbled together some definitions for us. So we have to think of values as a system of a priori beliefs which serve as a principled foundation from which to reason things like how important a thing is or how right or wrong a thing is. I say a priori beliefs because we come to our values without them being constructed um, in by situational experimentation. This is what we believe, our credo, right? And we'll look at some values in a little bit. Ethics, I like to think about ethics as a set of rules that govern the decision-making process by which we decide what is right or wrong in a given situation. Ethics are strongly influenced by our values and the framework of ethical duties, obligations, and responsibilities that we are charged to consider. And when I say charged to consider, I mean we as social workers have a documented and articulated set of ethical duties, obligations, and responsibilities. And those are the things that we are charged to live out in our social work practice. Yeah. So if that's sounding a little abstract, then let's say something like this, that our value is something like that, that all human beings have value and that their contributions and their welfare should be considered in all spaces. Okay? So that's a value. All human beings have value, have worth, and they should be considered in all of our decision-making processes. Okay? So in our ethics, we might say that when we're doing parental capacity assessments or parenting and decision-making processes, that we want to assess all members of the family and consider what their needs are and how we can best safely meet their needs and hear their voices in the context of the assessment. Right? So that's an ethical rule associated with our value that all people are valuable and have worth. And then how do we do that? So, for example, if one parent is in prison or one parent was charged with assaulting another parent or a child, they still have value. So our values tell us. And our ethics then drives us to practice in a way that includes them safely. Right? So that's how values and ethics kind of shape our parenting and decision-making assessments, because there are other professionals who might simply dismiss the participation of a particular person because they have been disqualified for participation based on their legal status or their perpetration of a particular harm historically. Okay? Okay? But our values would and our ethics would challenge us to do something differently. Okay? Why values in parenting assessment? Well, uh, it is the unique social work location values practice from a base of values, in my view. Our person and environment perspective brings the complexity of human history and relational and systems interactions into the assessment process. So we don't just look at the individual, we look at them within the complexity of human history, relationships, and the systems and how they work to affect the individual and the family. And once we begin to lean into that complexity, you can understand that an actuarial that is a checkbox that isn't going to be that useful because we're going to be challenged to balance the effect of history on this family and our very understanding of the nature of parenting and how that has oppressed certain groups of people and how it has privileged other groups of people. And our practice is going to have to balance some of that oppression, right? So we bring that values into the assessment process. Other professions may focus on assessing a parent's internal processes and level of measurable wellness. So we would diagnose and we would assess their cognitive capacity, and we would make a parenting decision based on those things with all of those other larger considerations, global considerations, oh, ignored. That is not social work. So social work brings a valued, laden assessment process to this practice. Values are also important in balancing short-term benefits versus long-term outcomes. This is something that I think has been challenging in child welfare practice, for example, when we're driven by this whole idea of child risks that are being presented to children and child in need of protection. That is a very immediate and present consideration that doesn't necessarily ask the question, what is the long-term impact of this parent's presence in the life of this child over the course of their future, right? And so we need to bring the values um, that into that consideration that then balances the immediate risk and harm to the long-term outcomes. And that is certainly something that we do in parenting and decision-making assessments for sure. Okay. One of the things I like to say is that transparency of our values in conducting assessments are essential, right? If we are going to have a values uh, based decision making and assessment model, it's going to be critical that we are able to be transparent about what those values are. Um, and so explaining values-based decision-making in assessments is more complex than simply reporting scores on actuarial tools. To be understood, values must be clearly stated and recommendations must be clearly explained. This helps the lay reader to connect the dots, right? So this is just uh, uh, I guess what I'm saying here is that yeah, our values just need to be expressed. And we need to find ways in which to articulate and explain our values in the context of assessment, which is quite challenging by times. Yeah. So then let's just take a peek at the values, right? So if we go back to the parenting and decision-making values, it lists 9 guidelines, right? Social justice advocate, human rights, respect for diversity, empathy and compassion, integrity and professionalism, collaboration. So some of the things that I've been suggesting as I've been reviewing the guidelines and considering these things is that when it comes to being a social justice advocate, um, that seems to need to be balanced against the need for things like objectivity, that word that often gets thrown around in the context of forensic assessments. And what I like to say is that a values-based assessment process is not objective, right? Objective would suggest that we are neutral, right? And as social workers, in my view, we are never neutral. We are values based in our practice. So that doesn't mean that we side with parent A over parent B. It's not that kind of lack of neutrality that I'm suggesting. It's that we are advocates for ensuring that the historical oppressions that various peoples have experienced are not replicated or reinforced by our parenting and decision making assessments. So, in our assessments, we are finding ourselves advocates for social justice, right? So, for example, if there's extreme income difference between parent A and parent B, we are going to talk about how income disparity can affect parenting. And we're going to say that even though parent A's home is clearly more lavish, and parent A has the ability to give the child more material resources, that we are not advocating for parent A based on that alone, and that historically poor folk have been disadvantaged and oppressed when it comes to parenting and decision making, and we are going to balance that in the context of our report. Similarly, we would be doing these things in cases where race is a question in assessment, particularly in cases where there are mixed race couples who are separating and divorcing, and parenting and decision making assessments need to reflect on the oppression experienced by Black or Indigenous or immigrant parents vis-a-vis white Canadian parents, as an example, right? It's interesting because in our work we have to advocate for women because of the historical injustice that women have experienced, and the history of material oppression that women have experienced in the process of separating and divorcing. At the same time, that we have to balance and we have to acknowledge the disadvantage that men have received in the whole parenting and decision making history, given the old doctrine of the vulnerable child and the preference for maternal care of children over paternal care. So we have to be constantly balancing these things and advocating. So, and of course, when we think about advocacy, we're thinking about human rights, respect for diversity. So we also have to think about empathy and compassion, right? That social workers, in the context of conducting parenting and decision-making assessments must be able to demonstrate compassion and manufacture genuine empathy for the people that they're assessing. Right? So I say compassion is something that we demonstrate, and empathy is about the honest feelings that we are able to bring, an understanding of our client's location and an appreciation for the circumstances that they find themselves in. Right? And I think that sometimes we actually have to manufacture the empathy. We have to work on it until we find it. Right? But that is an actual requirement. It's based on our values. We believe that all people have worth. And so in all circumstances, people ought to be appreciated, valued, and understood. And that's empathy. So, as social workers, we recognize the necessity for cultivating empathy for our clients. And I suppose in some ways that's consistent with a strengths-based perspective on assessment, because it's about really being able to see the value and the worth in the individual and having some ways that we can articulate that in our assessment. That's part of integrity and professionalism from a social work perspective, as far as I'm concerned. Okay. Collaboration is an interesting value here, right? Particularly given that the legal process of separating, divorcing, as we practice it now in Canada, in our society, has been largely attached to the adversarial legal system, right? And so um, even families that seem to be able to get along fairly well through the process of separating, once that matter comes into the family court system, there's an adversarial structure that needs to be actively resisted if folk are going to be able to maintain their capacity for working collaboratively to resolve parenting and decision-making issues. And certainly the social worker who's conducting a parenting and decision-making assessment should model collaboration. And we do that in the way in which we engage in the relationships with the professional and collateral contacts that we have. So, for example, we don't um, engage with the adversarial disposition of our clients' lawyers, right? We we don't engage with other assessments and reports which might be before the court that we've reviewed in preparing our own, where practitioners have obviously taken a side. And that's very challenging for us because we, as social workers, never want to be in the role of dueling expert, fighting another assessor. And so we need to find ways to collegially and collaboratively um, uh, bring forward our recommendations and observations in a way that is non-adversarial, even when it is not in disagreement with other professionals. We take a person and family-centered approach, of course. That is essential, and which I guess implies, going back to number 4, that we have come to understand and develop compassion and understanding for the family. When we say person and centered, family-centered approach, we are always thinking about best interest of child in context of family, recognizing that some of the rights of children are to have a family and contact and involvement with their family members. Okay? Continuing education and self-reflection is interesting. And as I was preparing this, I was saying, every single assessment should be approached like a case study. Right? And so when you're conducting an assessment, you are in the laboratory of human and family systems investigation, and you will be studying elements of this family as you go through your assessment, right? So there is a continuing education element to this work generally. We should always be updating ourselves so that we keep abreast of what is the state of the art in parenting and decision-making assessment and parenting assessment and child development assessment and the like. But we should also be studying the family and bringing that knowledge to the family in question, and even we'll find issues that are occurring in the family that'll send us to do research and increase our understanding of things. That's part of building empathy and compassion, is to understand. And then, of course, self-reflection, because we will find in working with some families that our values are challenged and our particular outlook on what is best for children and families. Um, and we, as social workers, need to lean into that and be reflective in our practice. And then number 9 is almost, it sounds a little bit like it's a reproduction of number 1, social justice advocacy. But I'd say that social workers who work, regardless of what sector they are in, part of the larger social work practice, what would I say it, imperative, is that we are constantly engaged in advocacy and public education, public and systems education. An example in the parenting and decision-making arena is that it's been one of the things that I've been advocating for is a clearer statement such that judges are able to take judicial notice of certain elements of child development and so, for example, the idea of moving away from custody access to parenting and decision making is in part because of the advocacy of practitioners who said custody and access doesn't work, right? People shouldn't have custody of their children. Yes, we do need to describe how parents access their children and how they ought to be showing up in their lives, of the lives of their children, in terms of time and methodology and how that works in a co-parenting situation. But all parents should be parenting their children. And so the idea that one person would have custody of a child is no longer in the lexicon. Instead, we describe how parents engage in parenting time and how they engage in decision making, recognizing that the child has the right to the influence and the contact with both of their parents in a way that is safe and supportive of the child's long-term development. So that is an area in which we have educated the systems and we've advocated for changes, and changes have made. And I've been saying we need to have an even clearer understanding of that based on the psychosocial developmental stages of childhood and what we know children need at each stage of development. I think that sort of guideline will be a lot more complex than a, child support guidelines that we have currently. But the child support guidelines did what they were meant to do, right? by establishing a national set of child support guidelines, we've eliminated much of the litigation that happens in family courts because the guidelines pretty much direct where things should land, and then the arguments that need to be made are variations on the pre-established guidelines rather than starting from scratch in every single case. And I suspect, certainly one of my points of advocacy, are that we do something similar for the courts and for families relative to parenting and decision making. So now let's go to the guidelines, but I feel like we should pause for a minute. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pause just for a minute to see if there are any questions about that portion of the program. The next section, I've been, like I said, cobbling together some things. So I want to show you the guidelines and I want to show you some bits and pieces of an assessment so that in the final portion of this program, in portion four, we'll actually have a kind of a set of guidelines. And Tyler's reminding us that if we have questions, we can just put them in the Q&A function. Okay. So, are there any questions about values and ethics as they apply to parenting and decision-making assessment? Okay. Well, feel free from this point on to interrupt me as you may need to. Um, Outline of parenting. Okay, so I'm going to go. I have to pull up three things here. Outline. Just bear with me. Okay. So the first thing I'd like to do is to just flash this for you, which is the parenting decision-making assessment guidelines that were established by the college that is the foundation of the work that we've been doing. And I'm going to just leaf right through the sections. Part one, considering best interest. Part two, the knowledge. Part three, the clinical skills. Part three, four, and five, really focusing on clinical skills. Part six now, values, and we've just reviewed the social justice values, and then implementation. Okay. So here in section seven are the various things that are being suggested that as we are implementing assessment should show up, right? So there's interviews and observations, children's views and preferences, descriptions of the child who's at the center of the assessment, the need for a balanced approach, confidentiality, joint interviews, significant others, collaterals, objective tests, home visits, report writing, okay? Report distribution, court preparation, settlement conferences. Okay? So those are kind of the 14 areas that we'll be considering when it comes to implementing this stuff. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of um, just give you an idea of this. So people might know that I've been involved with the People's Counseling Clinic. I founded the People's Counseling Clinic several years ago, and and one of the things that we do at the People's Counseling Clinic is we do parental capacity assessments and parenting and decision-making assessments, right? And what I would like to do is I'd like to share with you what is a developing outline, and I've cut and pasted elements of an actual, well, this is old, so it's a custody and access assessment. Today we'd call it a parenting and decision-making assessment into the mix. So I say first you really have to identify yourself and your institutional affiliation, and you can do that within your letterhead. If properly address the receiver, is it the lawyers, the court, the parties? Custody and access, identify all of the parties, and so here you've got the parents and the children, and then clearly articulate the reason for the referral. Right? Before you even begin to undertake an assessment, you should ask yourself the question, why is this assessment being asked for? Because not all families that are going through separation and divorce need a parenting and decision-making assessment. Only those families who aren't able to come to some agreement collaboratively are going to end up requiring these assessments. And so there's usually some hitch that you are going to be asked to address. And I think it's going to be important for you, if you do these assessments, to have a clear statement of what that hitch is, right? It might be because parent A thinks that parent B has a serious and persistent mental illness that incapacitates them and therefore should give parent A more parenting time and more decision-making authority. Right? And so part of the assessment might be around considering that question from parent A. Parent B, of course, disagrees. In an assessment like that, it's likely that not only are you going to be interviewing the parties, interviewing the children, but you'll also be looking at assessments or doing your own mental status evaluation if that is something that is within your scope of practice. Right? So clearly articulate the reason for the referral. Right? And this is just a cut and paste from a situation. So I did a parenting and decision-making decision where one of the parents had a history of sexual offending. Um, um, and uh, and so I was doing a parenting and decision-making assessment with the specter of one of the partners sexual offending in the background. Right? The other thing I always say that's part of your formulation is you need to identify yourself and your team. More information here will inform the reader of your academic and professional background and give insights into the origin of your values and your ethics, and even your expertise. Right? So this is how I tended then to describe myself, and sometimes, depending upon the nature of the assessments, you would highlight particular things, right? So I've been a member of ATSA since 1998, and I've regularly attended and taught at the ATSA conference in Massachusetts. This is part of my background, right? And so that informs the reader that, oh, there's a history of sexual offending in this assessment. The person doing the assessment has a background and experience in that area. The other thing is clinical values and legal notes. Clinical value and legal notes, which is a form of education and advocacy. So often when there are issues that are at the foundation of your report, even before you start to talk about who the parents are, what their background is, who the children are, and what their background is, I sometimes will add certain information notes, right? It might be a note about parenting in the Black community, a note about the history of queer parenting in Canada. It might be a note about parenting, poverty, and the role of the extended family. Anything that I can do before I get into who the people are that I'm assessing that can articulate clearly my knowledge and my values and ethics related to a substantial topic area that I'm about to delve into, I find it helpful to put that up front in my assessment so that then when I'm talking later on about the issues in the assessment, the reader has already been informed and has already not only been informed about the issue, but has been informed about my uh, position on the issue, my values-based position on the issue, if that makes sense. Right. So what I've done is I've expressed these things is in the in as 7 point ought ought. And there's just so there's in this case a note on BDSM, a note on domestic violence, a note on mental health and parenting, a note on supervised versus facilitated visits. This is an interesting one, and I've only given you a small paragraph on each of these things. But when you think about educating and advocacy, I have for a very long time been an advocate against supervised access, right? If you're in a child protection environment or in a custody or a parenting and decision making family court environment, and one of the parents um, has supervised access to their children, I am against that. If there's ever a concern that a parent cannot safely interact with their children, then I believe that that parenting time should not be supervised. It should be facilitated, right? Supervised means that a person is put in the corner of the room to observe artificially your engagement with your child and to ensure that during the time that you're there, you do not harm the child, right? And my bias is that if there is a reason to believe that a person might be limited in their capacity to interact with their child, then for the sake of that child and for the sake of building that relationship with the parent, we should facilitate that access to ensure that both parent and child have a valuable and healing time together rather than uh, simply a supervised time that helps to gather evidence about the nature of the parent's um, inability. So that's just, again, an example of how we might add a clinical note, a values note, or a legal note in the preamble to our report or early on in our report to help establish our location. And then we get into interviews and observations, right? Right. So social workers completing parenting and decision-making assessments must complete an age-appropriate interview with the child independently, as well as with relevant individuals involved in their care, such as teachers, therapists, healthcare providers, etc. And and I've here in this text, you'll notice that this text is Arial and this text here is in Times New Roman. Um, I've listed here started to list here the guidelines that I use when doing assessments. So we do family context and current stressors, but we could just call it interviews and observations. But the guidelines then articulate those areas that we should be observing, right? So parents and caregivers' perspectives, parents' ability, and parents' capacity. Um, Now, there's a difference between abilities, willingness, and capacity that I won't pick apart in detail here, but perhaps I'll try to define. When we think about a parent's ability, we're talking about their observable ability to complete concrete tasks that are essential for the parenting in the now, right? So if you're parenting an infant, can you feed an infant? Can you bathe an infant? Can you change an infant? Can you regulate the waking and sleeping time of an infant? Right? Can you respond to an infant's needs in a consistent way such that that child is able to feel safe and cared for? That's a capacity. I'm sorry, that's an ability in the now, right? There's a willingness element to this, particularly when it comes to the ability to cooperate with each other, because sometimes parents have such a wall of resentment that even though they might have the ability to do a thing, they don't want to do a certain thing, uh, and so they show up in an oppositional or a confrontational way. So, for example, a parent may stop doing a thing for a child in order to require that the other parent do that thing. And that's not about the parent's ability, but their willingness. Right? A capacity is a greater ability to capacity has the ability to grow over time. And so when we think about a parent's capacity to focus on and address a child's needs, we're thinking not only about their ability right now as an infant to care for an infant, but their likely capacity to care for a toddler and an early school age child and a pre-adolescent and an adolescent, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a way to assess that capacity. Right? So these are all of those issues that the guidelines suggest we should be investigating when we are interviewing. And of course, family history, child's history, their ability to engage with extended family and other supports and resources. These are all things that we should be observing. In our assessments, it'll be important that we articulate all of the things we did from which we are drawing those assessments. So I've just listed here the 3-hour interviews and video conferencing with each of the parents, um, the telephone interviews that I made with collaterals, the 2-hour supervised access with children, and review of file material and all of that sort of thing. So you need to articulate that in your report. Of course, then there's the child at the center of the assessment. And you'll notice here that I just reversed 7.2 and 7.3, right? So there is a responsibility for you to describe the child who's at the center of the assessment, the child or children, right? Because of course, parenting ability, parenting capacity, uh, parents' relationship with the child, we first need to understand who is the child who's at the center of this assessment, because it may be possible to parent a very capable, perfectly healthy child who we can project will have a normal course of development, but a child with any kind of special need, developmental delay, a child who's emerging as a queer, non-binary, or trans child, all of those kinds of things will affect the parent's capacity. And we need to know the child in order to do that work. I reverse these things because I think we need to know the child and just be able to describe the child before we're able to get into what the child's views and preferences are. And remember that this is really not when we think about child's views, and sometimes people will be asked to do things called voice of a child assessment, which I don't like to think of as a separate assessment from a parenting and decision making assessment because it's really a part of a parenting and decision making assessment. But sometimes you'll be asked just to do that, particularly with older children. And it's a clinical filter. If it was just about hearing what the child wanted, then we would just the child would come to court as a witness and describe what their desires were. But we really have to frame a child's views and preferences within the history and the knowledge of the family and our knowledge and understanding of best interest and children's rights and the child's capacities, right? Because the child might be thinking about what they want now, and we might need to filter that through an understanding of what the child might need developmentally over time. Okay? There are a couple of other things here. I'll just show again the balanced approach, which should talk about the we are not going to be taking sides. Confidentiality, of course. There are limits to confidentiality in these sorts of assessments, right? Because even though you're not going to say to the parents verbatim what the children have said to you, um, what the children say to you will influence your understanding of the nature of the relationship between parents and child, and ultimately will influence your recommendations. Okay? And then joint interviews. Um, I always want to see the parents in the presence of their children. Um, which gives me some greater insight into the nature of the parent-child bond. Um, and then, of course, there's the conducting of assessments or interviews with others and collaterals and the like. Okay. Um, just a quick note before we go to Q&A around objective tests. Again, social workers tend not to lean heavily into actuarial psychometrics in doing assessments. It is helpful, however, if we have ways of measuring things when it's important. So, for example, if a parent um, doesn't come with a clinical diagnosis and a mental health history, but we observe that they might be experiencing depression, it might be useful for us to be able to express that depression on, say, the Beck depression scale, which is a very, very low level assessment, which really is designed to, in my view, to describe depressive symptoms rather than to diagnose or to quantify, right? Or sometimes the parenting stress index is something that people will use when we believe that parents are um, becoming overwhelmed with the tasks of parenting. I won't talk too much more about that other than to say there's an entire market for actuarials out there in the world that people use. And if use actuarials as part of your practice, that is quite allowable. Social workers are not disqualified from their use, although certain tools would require you to have taken particular training in order to use them. Uh, I'm just going to in this section just follow up with the last few things. Home visits, of course, are important. There's a little bit of an outline of the report writing and what the report should include. Report distribution, again, even when we distribute and how we distribute reports, we should demonstrate um, our balanced perspective as we communicate with all of the players and their legal counsel. Court preparation and the participation in settlement conferences or the nature of settlement conferences are kind of special things that I will set aside for today. And like I said, in our fourth and final panel, where it's going to be much more open, and I will provide an outline, and we'll go through some exercises around where we would code certain things and the kinds of things we include in our assessments, and how we would then um, lead into recommendations. So I'm going to stop there for now. There are some other things that I could share, but let's lean into Q&A for now and and uh, see where that takes us. And as Tyler suggested, you can use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer your questions.
And just you might see me back, Robert, but I'm also here on camera again as
Yeah.
well and helping to moderate. Hopefully, folks have some questions, but it is, I don't know if other people are feeling this, but it's a rainy, slow Monday, so maybe people are feeling passive too. We'll see.
Yeah. I did pull up the sections from the parenting and decision making assessment that I'd conducted some time ago. I'd kind of de-identified it as best I could in preparation for today. So if there are questions, I could show segments of that. Yeah, yeah.
One of the questions I'm holding, Robert, and I think this is what I often come with, but how have you navigated the paradox of working within inequitable systems, within inequitable frameworks, oftentimes, while also striving for social justice, in particular with working with youth and parenting and decision-making assessments? Any examples or the experiences you can speak to?
Well, I've certainly um, I've been doing this a while, right? So, for example, um, consumption and purchase of of cannabis was at a time an illegal thing to engage in, right? And so I've done parenting and decision making as well as parental capacity assessments where one of the big issues was that a parent smokes pot, right? Right? So I'm saying, yeah, so what? And so, in order for me to help the systems, which are formal legal systems that would see the smoking of pot as an illegal activity, I've had to contextualize that as a social activity that we should be assessing in terms of the legitimate risks that it presents to children, which are limited, right? And the measure of incapacity, right? Rather than the digital presence or absence of the thing, right? And that has been challenging. And I've had to, again, been an advocate to say, though this parent smokes pot, they do not smoke pot in the presence of their children. They are not incapacitated when they're smoking pot. They are not engaging in dangerous criminal engagements, right? Because it would be one thing if the parent was regularly bringing people into their homes who were sketchy, dangerous individuals who carried weapons in order to exchange money for an illegal substance. It's quite another thing if they know a guy from their college days who they can score a little pot from, right? It's a very different thing. And so I've had to advocate against some of these legal biases that exist within the systems to describe parents as capable individuals, right?
Yeah, that's
Um,
super interesting. I really appreciate
yeah.
that perspective. And I think what I'm taking away from it is that like we all have to respect the law and that we work within legal frameworks, and we have to develop a bit of resilience and rigor around interpreting those laws in ways that are grounded in the purpose of the work that we're doing. Um,
Yes.
yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the social work assessor's job to put their finger on the scale
Mhm.
in favor of social justice in doing these assessments, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The world sees the family this way. I'm going to put my finger on the scales and say, wait now, from a human rights and social justice perspective, let's look at the family in this different way,
Mhm.
right? And that is very challenging. And I think it's challenging. It's challenging for people who are doing assessments within a forensic environment that is like a child protection environment, which is I guess that is also civil law, but child protection, which is um, the legislative definitions and the practice norms there are different than they might be in a family court location. And so it's very challenging. I remember early in my career having to recommend the return of children to a home where substances were an issue, but I judged that they were improving to the point where the children could be returned, even if the family was not yet completely a family of teetotalers. And I said, well, very few people in this office are teetotalers. So, but we're functional individuals, right? So those are some of the things that we have to do. But again, it's the job. It is the advocacy function is the unique social work perspective that we bring to parenting and decision making assessment. Right?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because when you took over the screen earlier today, talking about a lot of the harms and the challenges we're experiencing today are directly related to white supremacy and settler colonialism. And so also hearing as well that the binary approaches, this is in, this is out, this is right, this is wrong, are also reinforced by those dominant ways of knowing and being. And so having to hold on to a sense of that and a critique of the dominant norms of way knowing and with dominant ways of knowing and being, especially as things get more complex and we experience more complications across society. I think it's more important than ever that people develop their capacity to sit within paradox and tension.
Mhm. Well, I always say that, the interventions that we are now using to try to repair the harms that have occurred to Black peoples and Indigenous peoples, for example, right, are largely culturally based interventions, right? So when we think of Afrocentric practice, what we're really saying is that it might be necessary in healing the harms that Black people experience to find a way to go back to the culture, to go back to the natural resources that exist in that culture um, in order for the healing to occur. If we know that, then when we're doing parenting and decision making assessments, we should be then having a value that sees the importance of maintaining the cultural connection for this child. Even if materially they would do better with a parent that is not able to support their cultural background. Because we know in the long term, the psychosocial and even biological challenges that this child will experience, the healing will be in their cultural location. So that really challenges us to bring the values and our knowledge of those things to the practice. And again, we have to put our thumb on the scales of our assessment and say, I know that objectively, whatever that means, uh, parent A looks like they could provide better materially than parent B, but culturally, socially, historically, and prognostically, looking into the future, parent B has a lot more to offer here. And so we need to balance that. Yeah. It's a very big
Taking
challenge for us.
I'll be taking that the balancing the scales
Mhm.
and even just your visual metaphor of it, like of
Yeah.
it with me, because I think that's what we all do day to day, in
Yeah.
different contexts, different capacities, depending on our roles. But it's definitely something that I've been thinking a lot about lately.
Yeah.
Um, I'll say we're at 117 and would love to hear some
Mhm.
questions. If there are questions, maybe there aren't. I am going to post in the chat the links that I posted earlier in case if anyone
Mhm.
joined late, you may not have access to them. So you'll see the presentation from today, including Robert's presentation, the actual document and webpage for our guidelines for parenting and decision-making assessments, and also a manual guidelines and a case example from a Toronto resource around parenting capacity and decision-making assessments. I'm also going to post in a link to our evaluation form. And I'm going to share my screen here. Just bear with me. Um, I'd just love to hear from folks if you have capacity or energy for this, just something you're taking away with you from today's session. So, an idea that you heard that you'll take with you into your practice, or anything else that you want to share to help you close out this experience for you today. Um, and also, again, reminder evaluation, you're welcome to use this QR code or the link in the chat. There's also going to be a follow-up email later today with a link to the evaluation form. So you can let us know what the session was like for you. Did it hit the mark? And give us any other ideas you might have or suggestions for PD going forward. And then, of course, wanted to highlight some upcoming activities. Next week, we have our Cultivating Our Wellness. This is a community practice specifically tailored towards the prevention of vicarious trauma and secondary stress. On Wednesday, April 22nd, I believe that's Wednesday, we have our Code of Ethics presentation in French language. We'll be joined by Joël Badman, who will be leading us through a session, one that we've offered before, but tailored to the French language. We'll have a session with Alec on April 24th around poverty as a political choice. We'll have a closed group space for Black and African social workers as community practice on May 7th. And then we'll have our final session on parenting and decision-making assessments on May 11th. Again, that's meant to be more interactive, allowing us to apply some of the skills and knowledge in discussion and in small groups. So if you want to go a little bit deeper and bring together the thoughts and the energy and the information you've experienced with these three sessions, please come on May 11th. Robert, any final words?
Well, I would just say that the um, values, we were focusing on values and ethics. But really, the values-based assessment process does demand a high degree of reflection on the
Mm,
part of the practitioner and an ability to articulate in writing the foundation of your values when you're when you're formulating your assessment. Uh, um, and I'm just reflecting on this because I was recently, I've been doing some work with the Association of Black Social Workers and the Afrocentric Clinical Specialist cohort. And so one of the things that we do is we do role play in therapy. And so I'm often the therapy client, and people are uh, interviewing me. And one of the students, one of the participants asked me this question because I was, representing that I was have struggling with a particular thing. And then they said, Robert, what are your values? What are the values that drive you? And in the moment, being asked that question really set me on my heels, right? Because I, of course, am a values driven individual, but how often do you articulate your values? How often do you think about how your particular values are in the moment influencing your decision today? And so I had to pause and shut my eyes, and I was able to come up with values that, of course, I've been living with and have been refining and adopting and adapting for my entire life. And after I stated them, it brought such clarity to the conflict or the dilemma that I was dealing with. And and I had a real moment there in this counseling. Really, it was what do you call it? A role play, but I had a real moment, and and I think that when you're doing parental parenting and decision making assessment, there will be lots of opportunities to sit back and ask, what are my values? What's making it difficult for me here? Yeah. Here's a good question that I see in the chat. Thank you, Billy, for the question. Um, what sort of confidentiality paperwork do people sign? Is verbal consent a thing, or do you keep track of who you can talk to for collaterals? Um, well, I when I'm working with people in a parenting and decision making, well, actually, with all of the clients that I work with, as part of my intake form, I have a release of confidentiality form. The nature of my practice is such that I'm almost always asking to be able to speak to someone else. When I'm doing these assessments, what part of my first interview with each of the adult partners is to ask, I'm going to also be asking for collaterals and who are the people who should be in your collateral list. And I'll write the list at the beginning of the interview. And then as the interview goes on, I will probably add to the list people that their story suggests that I would want to talk to. And then I put all of that right on my release of information form, and I will sign off. I'll get them to sign that. Today, when we do so much work virtually, I have taken on the practice of taking verbal consent um, over the phone or on Zoom. But what I'll do is I will write the same form, on the same form, all of the people that I've gotten permission to see, and then I will share with them the list. We'll amend the list as appropriate, and then I'll sign off and say, gained verbal consent on such and such a date via whatever, whatever. Um, and of course, that form then informs who I can talk to. So that's pretty straightforward. Thanks for that, Billy.
One thing I see a growing movement towards is the understanding that consent changes over time. And so people having to navigate consent on an ongoing basis, which I think you were, speaking to. And I didn't know a lot of our systems aren't set up that way. They're set up under, prioritization of written words. And when someone signs off, that's considered universal. So in our place of social justice and anti-oppressive practice and decolonizing, understand that consent changes. So investigating
Hmm.
that over time with service users is really important.
Yes, absolutely.
See a question here from Holly. In terms of multiple ways of knowing and doing and understanding RA diagnosis and DSM and accessing a parent, um, wondering if you have any thoughts on that, just related to the
Sure.
DSM and assessing a parent.
Yeah. Um, Well, one of the things I point out is that parenting and decision-making assessments are not diagnostic in terms of mental health. They are somewhat diagnostic and prognostic related to parenting capacity and capacity to co-parent. And those two things are not DSM diagnosable, right? And so this is where social workers need to lean into their expertise around those things in making descriptive assessment of parents' capacity and ability. If people come to us with diagnosed DSM mental health concerns, again, I'm not interested in confirming or contradicting those assessments because for me, the issue is not what your diagnosis is. The issue is your capacity for parental functioning, right? And parental functioning includes capacity to co-parent and capacity to relate to the community and service providers. And so there are things other than DSM diagnostic criteria that we should think about. The old DSM used to have a thing called the Global Assessment of Functioning Scale. I don't know if people are familiar with the GAF, but they've done away with it now in preference to the ICD-9's assessment scale format. But I find those to be much more helpful because we're not interested in whether a person is depressed or bipolar or has a persistent mental illness. We're interested in whether or not they can maintain a civil relationship with their co-parent, whether or not they can facilitate having the grandparents, the uncles, and the neighbors engaged as appropriate in caring for their child, whether or not they're able to show up at the daycare and maintain working relationships with the daycare and the teachers. That's the kind of thing that we need to assess for. And that has less to do with diagnosis and more to do with functioning, right? One of the things I like to say is that if it takes a village to raise a child, then it is a parent's job to curate and maintain the village. And if a parent, for whatever reason, diagnosable or not, does not have the capacity to curate and manage the village, then their parenting capacity is compromised. Right?
Interesting, Robert. And knows we're almost at time, but I do see one more question around, working with service users. What if they don't consent? Any final thoughts on that before we wrap up?
Then you just list that as a thing that you didn't do, express the limitations that it might bring to your decisions, but again, as part of the advocacy and education piece, put your thumb on the scale. Why might a certain client not agree to have you access records from a particular service provider? Right? Yes, I grew up in foster care, right? But oh, you grew up in foster care. Well, do you mind if I take a look at your child welfare record as part of, but no, I don't want you to do that. Why? Well, because I wasn't well looked after in foster care. Those people, and then you get the expletive. Okay, I get it. You
Yeah.
did not have a good experience in being a child in the child welfare system. That is going to limit my abilities in some regards, but I also need to put into my report how I can understand how a former child in care might not wish to revisit that history in the course of the work that I am doing, trying to figure out how to support them in coming to parenting and decision making decisions. Right. So we have to understand these things. But again, we wouldn't be able to do that if we were not informing ourselves about the experiences that children in care sometimes have, right? So that's why we need to to put on our caps. We can't simply say, well, if I wanted to parent my child, I would give a therapist access to everything, right? Because then we're really yeah, that's we're judging people based on our standards of behavior for ourselves rather than trying to develop that compassion and that empathy for the client in their own lived experience. Yeah.
Well, Robert, it's always a pleasure having you here, and I appreciate you
Yes.
leading us through these three sessions so far and looking forward to the upcoming one in May. Um, Folks, I hope you have things to look forward to and that you enjoyed your time here today and that you have a good rest of your week. It's supposed to be rainy and gross here in the city, anyways, but hopefully it'll be a bit sunnier later on. Um, we will have a recording available of this probably in the next few weeks on our YouTube, and really hope that you folks on the call consider coming to the session on May 11th. I think it'll be quite interesting and allow us to dig into some of these questions a little bit more deeply. But otherwise, yeah, thanks so much, Robert, and
Very
have a great
welcome.
day, everyone.
You're very welcome. And thanks everyone for showing up and look forward to seeing you May 11th.